situations. So that is the other reason why I choose that word. This is from a pamphlet that I got when I visited a Christian Catholic charity in Havana. This is the equivalent of like what would be like Catholic Charities of Oregon or something like that. It's not a radical organization. It's a very mainstream social service organization, church NGO. Whoops. But what is interesting about this, I thought what is interesting about this brochure to me is the language that they use to describe their vision statement. It doesn't translate easily into English, and it's difficult in Spanish as well. But basically, they're describing similar to how Paul does, this sort of very non-individualistic way, a sort of as if we are one body, one sort of organism as a community struggling for justice. So it basically says the people and the families accompanied by Caritas, that's the organization, are protagonists in solidarity with their personal and social history, satisfying their needs. But the way that it's said is solidarity is not just a noun. Solidarity is an adjective. It's a way to be. And they say Caritas accompanies their people for the sustainable transformation towards a just and society with solidarity, and again with the adjective of solidarity. Promoting the conscious participation, conscious and responsible participation. So it's a very active, very mutual, very collective sort of way to be, and I love that because I think it expands the way we can think about love. And anyway, this is our photo before we left. I will now be sharing some more of the photos. These are some pictures from this place, Museo de la Denuncia in Havana, and this on the left, the crosses are to mark the whole entire museum is dedicated to victims of U.S. intervention in Cuban history. And this was a very emotional visit for me and the other students who visited there, because for many of us, it was the first time of confronting that our countries are enemies, and we never had heard about some of the atrocities that were committed by our government against the Cuban people. And so this is where it's kind of impossible to not be a little bit political. But I think it's really important to acknowledge these things because our friendship between Cuban and American Quakers takes place in a way that somewhere in Cuba, there's a file about me that tells the stories that I'm telling you from someone else's perspective who I've never met. And also somewhere in the United States, there's also a file like that that tells the stories that I'm telling you from a different perspective, from another person who I've never met. And that's the kind of conditions under which we're forming friendships and trying to be in Christian fellowship together. And that is really intense and needs to be, I think, acknowledged. And the other thing that I wanted to encourage, I guess, is just that we can, in a spirit of solidarity, that we can somewhat suspend our attitudes about the political situation enough so that we can really see the humanity of each other and the complexity of the lives that we lead, which are not strictly about politics. Whatever your politics are, I assure you, whatever you think about Cuba, and if you think that Fidel Castro is one of the worst world leaders that ever existed, or if you think that Cuba is a great progressive social project, there's someone in the Cuban church, the Cuban Quaker church, who shares your perspective. They also have the whole spectrum of different ideas and beliefs about this, and it is significant to their experience, but it's also not all of their experience. Just like us and just like everyone in the world, they are struggling to meet their own needs, to sort of figure out how to solve problems and navigate complicated life and figure out how to be good Christians. And that is happening in that context. And yet, like somebody said to me in Cuba, you know, we don't think about politics all the time here. Not everything is all about politics in Cuba. We think about food. We think about what clothes we like. We listen to music. We have full lives. So I encourage you, if you can, to somewhat be able to put those things in one spot and be open to what else. Oh my gosh, I don't know why this is happening. Okay, I see. Okay, so on the right, this red display is meant to represent the enemy, and the enemy in this case is us, or is, I should say, members of our government projects. And the reason that they did this exhibit this way, they said, is because the face of the enemy is always obscured, that you can never see who they really are. And that's because there was you know, secret operations happening and things like that. So this is just a very powerful piece, I think, to speak to a tragedy that happened, despite the fact that these that this is the political situation, and that Cubans know these stories very well of innocent people who were killed because our governments were in a conflict over how Cuba runs its government. Despite that, we didn't really encounter resentment from Cubans or distrust. People were incredibly open, and I think that comes from the sense of solidarity that is very much a cultural thing in Cuba, I believe. I don't know for sure, but I think that it may predate the revolution, because Cuba experiences a lot of natural disasters. The Caribbean experiences a number of tropical storms and hurricanes each year. And as a result of that and some of the other harsh conditions that they live in all the time, they really have to rely on one another. And that has often throughout Cuban history been the way of life. It's definitely the way of life now. And for example, a lot of people don't have refrigerators, but like I stayed at the home of a pastor, and the pastoral family didn't have a fridge, but the neighbor stores their meat for them. And so every time you need something like to cook, you have to go knock on the neighbor's door and they bring that over. And so life is very much lived in a more communal fashion for that reason. One of the things that I talked about recently on Facebook that a lot of people expressed interest in is the Cuban way of handling natural disasters, which is very different than in the United States and really interesting. And basically everyone in Cuba is trained and knows exactly what their specific job is in the case of different types of emergencies. And when they activate an alert, there's basically like a map of the entire community that identifies who the most vulnerable people are, so that resources can be dedicated first to the people who are most vulnerable. And those people, for example, if there's a hurricane, the neighborhood will have a map of, okay, here's where the houses are that don't have a good roof. Here's where the houses are where a single person who's elderly lives alone. Here's the houses that, you know, the person who lives here has a disability and needs assistance to get around physically. And so when an emergency is activated, they know exactly who needs the extra help. And they might, for example, they will dedicate all of the national transportation to moving specific people who don't have a good roof or who are disabled to another location. And as a result, they've had very little loss of life in natural disasters for the past 50 years or so. So that type of project is a great example of how people collaborate together and how that way of life is just part of the kind of environment and things. This is the, whoops, sorry. This is the city of Hibara. This is where a lot of the Quaker activity happens in the northeastern part of the country. This is a horse and cart, which is the primary form of transportation in Hibara, and I rode it daily. And as you can see, you sit very close with people, with your body touching their body, and it's a really bumpy ride. And a lot of times people are having to carry something large. For example, if you have to buy something at the hardware store or something, it's not like you can just take your private car. So sometimes people have something heavy to carry, or they're carrying a baby. And everyone just organizes together to support the people who need it and to make room and make it a pleasant experience. And these kinds of daily experiences where you're very up close and personal in a collective situation that's kind of challenging really build a sense of connection and trust with others that I think allows people to sort of have the courage to face some of the things that they face.